As instructors, our role is to teach, which can flirt the line of preventing failure for our students. It's a fine line because you don't want to discourage them for failing, but you also don't want to waste time failing in the wrong things. Because of this nuance, it is often difficult to know when to step in when someone is having a problem or they're problem solving. And you also don't want to steal their opportunity to learn for themselves. While I was at the weapons school, I had a pretty brilliant student, and I watched this brilliant student present his ideas to the entire class during a presentation. And I knew his idea wasn't going to work, or it would work, but it was going to be a suboptimal execution of the idea. I had all the data for this, and instead of letting him learn by failing during execution of this idea, I crushed his creativity essentially in front of the entire school. That moment taught me one of the most important leadership lessons that I've had in my career. If you teach people, if you lead people, if you're responsible for developing really anyone, this lesson was very important for me to learn because sometimes the best thing you can do as a leader is give someone all of the information they need and then step back, even when it's uncomfortable as hell. So as I get ready to describe this story of exactly what happened, I want to be able to provide this episode to you all as a platform of lessons learned, essentially, from the things that I failed in this scenario. So what happened? Going into my third year teaching at the weapons school, like I was talking about earlier, I thought I had figured it all out, basically, at least the syllabus. After teaching about 6 classes and probably having over 2,000 hours in planning in my career at that point, I developed a pretty solid understanding of what the quote unquote right solutions look like, at least when it came to my job. For really any given problem in special operations, though, I had maybe 4 or 5 answers in my head that would get at least the students to a passing grade, which is what they care about. I care about their development. I care about their learning and leadership and their personal development. We can get them to a passing grade. I can get them to learning new lessons, and everything will be great. I understood that there were different ways to get those answers. And as a creative thinker myself, I knew what right looked like from a big picture standpoint, but at the tactical level, you can try a bunch of different things and still end up with, generally speaking, the right answer. When this specific student showed up, he was a pretty brilliant dude, seasoned, very stubborn. When he believed in something he was doing was right, he really wouldn't falter away from that idea, regardless of who told him yes or no at the end of the day, which is something that I admired in him. I thought it was a really good trait, depending on the situation, obviously. In this story, we're running a training scenario where we're looking for a target along a simulated country border. The scenario was as simple as weapons school really can give to the students. So it was find a bad guy, get bad guy. However, the intelligence platform that we were using was unable to fly over that specific enemy country and border for us to get a pretty good understanding of where this bad guy actually was. When presented this scenario, the student actually came up with a pretty creative solution, which was to angle the aircraft at a different degree than typical. And when he presented this initially, I was really excited. This is exactly what we're looking for. This is really what we were trying to get the students to teach, was that autonomy and thinking outside of the box, creative problem solving even. But where it gets interesting was the theory behind his idea was solid. It would work based on the antenna that we were using and where they thought the target actually was. The problem, however, was that's not necessarily how airplanes fly. Generally speaking, aircraft wants to return to 0 degrees and level of flight. And so the angle of bank would have been too great for that specific aircraft to hold that specific orbit, and nearly impossible for our pilots to be able to maintain that angle. The student would then had to have changed his orbit into a scenario that was much more complicated and much less ideal than the initial problem they were trying to solve. Now, I did my research after his initial presentation of his solution, and that's how I discovered that the solution was suboptimal. It would have worked, but again, it was just not ideal for what we were trying to give to them. And that was a lesson that he needed to learn himself. But one thing that the school teaches you is when you present a good idea, you have to continue to do research as the situation changes to ensure that your good idea is still a good idea. And if you don't do that, you'll very quickly become a burden, not only to the rest of the students, but to the evolving solution. So over the next 6 hours of planning, every time the student would represent his angled aircraft idea, I kept telling him it wasn't going to work. I had the data, I had the answer, but I also knew where the target actually was going to be based on the design of the scenario. This student, being as stubborn as he is, continued to push back. And what was different about this time was usually when I presented data like this, he would understand, we would discuss it, and then the right answer would eventually present itself. But for some reason, this time was different, and he refused to back down from his initial findings. I didn't know this at the time, but he just truly wanted to try something different and non-standard that wouldn't have been that bad of an idea, just so he could see what would happen from executing something very non-standard. In this moment, he truly wanted to follow his natural curiosity. But again, like I was saying, I didn't know this at the time. So because I couldn't put my own ego and pride aside and what I thought was my mission to teach all of the students, I continued to get more and more agitated because our intelligence piece, his job / my job, played such a massive role in the outcome of the scenario and therefore the outcome of the other students learning. So after about the third or fourth time he presented this idea, like I said, it was about 6 hours into our planning cycle. I grabbed his attention as he was rushing past me, getting ready to go into the next brief. And I tried to pull him aside, but he didn't have much time. He had probably 10 seconds before the next brief. And I was like, hey man, this isn't going to work. The aircraft orbit is going to be off center. He looked at me and said, we'll talk later. I gave him a big thumbs up because I understood, like I said, he was rushing into the next brief. He went in, represented his idea to the entire group. There's about 15 people executing in this mission. Everyone said, yes, this sounds great. Not really thinking again about the big picture of the aircraft geometry and the orbit management that they would have to maintain, because to them, to most pilots, intelligence collect is pretty much just magic. And so they'll really accept anything that you'll throw at them, which is why I continue to double down on the fact that this wouldn't work. Also thinking that I was saving his credibility and partly my credibility as well, as he was my student, I guess. But in this moment, after all the students said that this is a great idea, I then stood up as an instructor and, I exclaimed again that this would not work. At that time, I presented the data on why it wouldn't work and why I wouldn't recommend doing this tactic based on the problem that the students were presented. And I tried to explain that it wasn't going to provide them the level of clarity or the solution that they were looking for. And they were very reluctant to accept my secondary findings because the students didn't know what was coming. So I sat my student aside and I basically had the conversation with him that I didn't want the rest of the students to lose out on their training. And so I essentially ordered him to change his tactic to something that was more researched, less creative, and not his original idea. As he does, my student conceded and he was able to set his pride and ego aside, which I was very proud of him for being able to do that. And we were able to move forward with a plan that I knew would work and he was going to be able to execute. Mission accomplished, right? Wrong. What's actually the takeaway here? I just explained all this like very technical, nuanced, tactical information that I learned and taught at the weapons school, right? So the big takeaway here is in my attempt to what I thought was save the scenario and the other students' training, I essentially stripped away the student's ability to learn in that specific scenario. I took away his autonomy to be a free thinker, which is the complete opposite thing that I wanted to do, especially as an instructor in the role that I was in at that school. For 4 months prior to this point, I kept telling him, come up with creative solutions. We'll guide you from there. In this specific instance, he came up with a creative solution. I agreed with him initially, and I even let him present it. But once I got new data, instead of teaching him why he needed to come up with a new solution, I just kept telling him no. What I should have done differently in that scenario is I should have shown him where the target actually was going to be. So the red plan, which typically students aren't privy to. And you can argue a little bit that that's cheating. But again, looking at the big picture of what I'm trying to actually accomplish, I don't really care if the students knew exactly where the target was. At that point in the course, my student had already perfected their ability to find a bad guy. That's not what I was testing. I was testing his ability to come up with a creative solution and then communicate that to a room of people that quite literally think he is doing magic tricks in front of him when it is just science and math at the end of the day. By showing him where the target was going to be, it would have been far more beneficial for him to see that, create a different plan that was actually going to work, and then present that to the students to show them that it is not actually magic tricks. Even if I had given my student the exact target location, I would not have been taking away training for him, and I would not have hurt the scenario for the other students at all, because they were inevitably going to mess something up. That's just how it happens. You can give them the entire scenario and someone's still going to screw something up that creates a cascading effect for the rest of their flight. That was option one in this scenario. Option two would have been to just let that student fail forward with his bad idea, rather than stepping in and mandating that he change his plan simply because I thought the other students were going to benefit more from it. In that situation, it was very conflicting for me to do that, because I wanted to do right by all the students, but you also have to look at the scenario as a whole and identify what's the most important lesson to be taken away as the instructor for, again, not just my student, but for all of the students. And I truly believe that allowing my student to fail forward and discover for himself what worked, what doesn't, and then allowing him to adapt in that scenario and then communicate that to the other students who are on equal playing field for him. Learning to think for yourself and developing your own specific knowledge from when you showed up, applying it to different scenarios to improve your learning and foundational knowledge is one of the essences of that course. And in that moment, I took away that student's ability to do exactly what we were trying to teach him. I failed him, and to be quite honest, I failed the other students as well. So with all that being said, there's three major things that I learned that day. First, as a mentor, your job isn't to prevent failure. It's to help people learn from it. When you step in to save someone from a mistake, you rob them of the lesson that failure teaches. Number two, when you take away someone's autonomy by forcing them down the same path that you've taken, you steal the most valuable thing they could gain, which is the ability to figure stuff out for themselves. Third, sometimes the best thing you can do as a leader is give someone all the information they need and then just step back. Even when watching them potentially fail, it makes you uncomfortable as hell. At the end of the day, I now understand that true development requires autonomy, even when it means watching someone fail. If you were to take the three things that I just shared and wrap it up into one tagline, truly it would be that development requires autonomy, and you just have to let people fail sometimes so that they can develop. I'm not a parent, but I typically hear parents talk mostly about either being a helicopter parent or kind of like a bullish parent is another term that I've heard before. And again, as a non-parent, I'll apply this to my specific scenario where I just simply wanted to see my student do the best that he could, but by forcing him down the path that I wanted him to take, I was limiting his potential. This is going to be a tough one because we always want to be around and provide a specific kind of support for the people that we love, but we just have to know what that person actually needs in that moment. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is just zip it and let them figure it out. So I share all this so you have a reach back point for the lessons that I've learned and lessons that other people have learned that I've presented in this podcast as well. I genuinely want to thank you for listening to this episode. And if you got this far and like the format, feel free to like, rate, and subscribe. It goes a super long way when we're talking all this algorithm stuff. And I hope you're enjoying your week, and I will see you next time. See you.